Kevin. Welcome back. This is the second chapter, part 2 in our series of discussions investigating how we heal. Okay, and in the course of this investigation, discussing health, healthcare, and holistic approaches to health and healing, and developing an understanding, a deeper understanding, such that it actually allows us to cultivate better health. Now, in the first chapter, we introduced a number of ideas. Perhaps most importantly, we said that health is innate. Okay? At some fundamental level, you have health available in your system. You are fundamentally okay. You fundamentally have an innate health, an innate expression of health that is always available and always accessible, no matter what your health challenges might be, all right? From, as it were, mortal to maintenance. Now, we also said that when we really consider health and different aspects of health, you know, from our biology and physiology to our healthcare systems and even the different approaches to health, alternative and conventional approaches, and all the different types of techniques and procedures and modalities, and even our belief systems themselves. So our belief systems that allow us or create a predilection to look at alternative approaches and wisdom traditions, predilections that turn us towards our Western empirical biomedical ways of understanding and addressing health issues. All of this creates a environment, a field of complexity that disempowers us, that tends to disempower us and disconnect us from our innate healing process as individuals. Now, we also suggested that fundamentally, you know, the problem with health really isn't about techniques or cures or procedures or alternative versus conventional, but fundamentally our problems that we face in this country with regard to health spring from a lack of a deeper understanding of health and healthcare. And to this end, we offered the holistic healing model, okay? A simple model, quite frankly. There's only 6 parts to the holistic model. So the question then becomes, how does this simple model, how does this simple map help us to negotiate and engage with and interact with the complexity of health in such a way that we're able to cultivate health in our system, in such a way that we can support our systemic resources in ways that enable them to respond to the demands of the environment, to the demands and stressors of the environment in our day-to-day lives. So in order to do this, in order to understand how the holistic healing model can allow us to mediate the complexity of health, we're going to step back and take a more general look at how we tend to use maps and models fundamentally, okay? So what are the fundamental properties of maps when we use them? The first area that I want to consider is this idea of logical levels, okay? Logical levels or levels of organization. Now, the classic metaphor for this idea is the Russian doll metaphor. And Russian dolls are a set of dolls from large to small that fit inside each other. Okay, so we have a little Russian doll that fits inside of a bigger Russian doll, and then inside of a bigger Russian doll, and so on, and so it goes. It goes all the way up, you could say, and it goes all the way down. Okay? And Russian dolls are, another way of saying it would be to say that these are whole dolls that are parts of whole dolls. So wholes that are parts of wholes. And this is really the notion of, when we think back to, perhaps for many of us in any case, in our introductory biology class or introductory physiology class, we talked about levels of organization. So the body is organized in much the same way, wholes that are parts of wholes, beginning with fundamentally atoms that make up molecules that in turn make up cells. These are the building blocks for tissues. Tissues make up organs. Organs combine in different ways to form organ systems, such as the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, skeletal system. And then these organ systems comprise the organism entire. So once again, we have wholes that are parts of wholes. And all of nature, all of reality really, has, for the most part, as we understand it, this type of structure. And this was perhaps first really understood, or first really modeled, one could say, by a guy named Benoit Mandelbrot, who developed a mathematical formula, relatively simple mathematical function, that enabled us to begin to very accurately reproduce very complex structures that we find in the world, that we find in things like how shorelines look, or river deltas look, or how tree roots spread into the earth, or how our cardiovascular system, our vascular system in our bodies, arteries and veins, spread throughout the body from large main roots, tap roots if you will, and into smaller and smaller vessels into the capillary systems. So the Mandelbrot set is essentially a way of modeling and showing how the world is comprised of wholes that are parts 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 of wholes, all the way up and all the way down. One of the interesting things, another way to think about this logical levels or levels of organization, is that there is an embedded recursiveness that happens, okay? So as we watch a Mandelbrot set begin to play out, we begin to see that there is a reiteration that happens, okay, as we move through our levels of organization, okay? Embedded recursiveness we find in the Mandelbrot set. Okay, so why is all this important? Well, we can see that this begins to suggest to us a way of responding and engaging with the complexity of health in an empowered way. Because matter in the universe is of a fractal nature, that is, it's connected and patterned through levels of organization and magnitudes of scale, we begin to get a feel for how we can grab the trunk or branch of the tree, as it were, and shake it in ways that can affect our health and wholeness throughout the levels of our organism, right? Throughout the levels of our organization. Everything we find connects and unfolds and is encompassed. So we can grab onto health and holistic understandings in their big picture simplicity and shake, as it were, and know that the reverberations can be felt all the way down through the layers of increasing complexity. And we can know that those vibrations manifest with positive changes in our experience of health and wholeness. Now, this begins to show us how we can engage with health, okay? Even if we're not experts in any of the wide array of fields or disciplines that pertain to health and healthcare, nonetheless, we can engage with health always. We can be empowered. Everything we do makes a difference and affects our health throughout our system. Okay, so this is critical, okay? This idea of wholes that are parts of wholes are critical to holistic models and understandings of the world. Okay. Now, I want to continue this discussion on logical levels, and I want to turn to now a different metaphor. I want to look at atlases and maps, okay? And atlases and maps are also examples of logical levels, are they not? if we look at an atlas, well, what is an atlas? An atlas is a book of maps. Okay, it's a book of maps, and it has a key, all right, or an index. So an atlas is organized in ways that allow us to begin to find our way into the more detailed maps that it contains. The atlas operates at a higher logical level than the maps that it organizes or contains. Now, a map, of course, or maps are the things that the atlas contains. And as we look at the maps, what we find is that they are at a lower logical level, but contain higher levels of specificity. So as we drop down into these lower logical levels, they enable us to access more detailed information. The individual maps could be said to cover less territory, but offer more information. So we step into the map, and then we step out again, or up, to gain a broader perspective, to orient ourselves, to gain a perspective of the world around us. Okay, so I step in to specificity, back out to gain a sense of context. Now, what's actually really quite interesting here is that as we move into different areas or different maps, we get access, or we gain access to different types of information, okay? In fact, every place we step, whether it's at the same logical level but in different areas, or if we step back out or up another logical level, what we're doing is we're accessing different types of information. And one of the interesting things is that when we look at a map of Florida and a map of Colorado, as we have here, we find that very quickly we might want to know about boats and oceans and sharks in a very different way than we may want or need to know about them living in Colorado, just as we might want to know about snowshoes, skis, and snowplows in a very different way in Colorado than we need to in Florida. Okay, so now if you're living in Florida but you're stuck with a map of Colorado, you're seriously compromised, right? If you don't have an atlas or a way of reorienting to a more useful map given your needs, you are compromised. And this may seem simplistic, but fact is, when it comes to health, many of us are stuck with just one map, one way of understanding health. And we have difficulty reorienting to more useful ways of understanding health. We have difficulty, for instance, engaging alternative maps of health because we don't have a good atlas or means of seeing and considering all the aspects of a holistic system. What we can begin to understand is that this is an atlas. It's a dynamic atlas, okay, that organizes maps of our body, maps of health and healing that exist at lower logical levels. So the holistic healing model enables us to step out from the discussion or back from the discussion of health to gain perspective, allow us to orient, and then allow us to step into different aspects or areas of that map at lower logical levels to get information about and specificity around different areas that affect our health and healing process. When we look at this map as an example, we can begin to consider the empirical, scientific, biomedical approach to health and healing and understand that it is an extremely potent and necessary map of health and healing, and yet it only represents a relatively small part of the holistic world. So it is necessary, but not sufficient. We could say the same thing about alternative approaches to health and healing. They are an important part of the holistic model, and in fact they're necessary, and yet they are not sufficient to encompass the whole of who we are, and in fact the whole territory of health and healing with regard to who we are as individuals. Okay, so now let's turn to this idea of paradigms and discuss for a little bit the field. If we're looking at the holistic healing model, this backdrop, the two rectangles against which the body and the mind and the spirit, and then the environment within which those aspects of ourselves play out. Well, that whole unit then, that whole system plays out against a backdrop, what we're calling the subjective paradigm and the objective paradigm. Okay, so let's take a little bit of time and discuss what it is that we mean by paradigms. Now, paradigms can be relatively nuanced, but we're going to try to keep it relatively simple here. Important to know that paradigms are more than perspectives. Paradigms are more than belief systems. Paradigms really point to the fundamental underlying presuppositions that we use to know the world around us. All right? Now, let's look as a way of beginning to explain what I mean by this. Let's look at the holistic model, and let's look at the two fundamental paradigms that we are using or building into our holistic model, okay? And are the objective paradigm and the subjective paradigm. Now, the objective paradigm, what we're saying is that this is a way of looking at and knowing the world in such a way that the person, the self, is pulled out. We pull ourselves out of the picture, so to speak, and then we know the world by using observations and measurements, but the person is not a part of what we are looking at or considering in this model. If we now turn to the subjective paradigm, the person, the self, is very much part of the picture, okay? So the world then is known through the eyes and ears and through our kinesthetic sense. It's known fully through the person, and how we know the world, we have to be in dialogue with the self. Now, with these two paradigms, we can see that, what's the different classes of information? Well, in the subjective paradigm, the self is critical and the self is empowered, okay? From the objective paradigm, the self is exercised and it's disempowered. It's innate to that particular paradigm. Doesn't make it a bad one, but in terms of our self, okay, and our empowerment, the objective approach and paradigm to understanding body, mind, spirit inherently exercises the self and disempowers us. So if we want to reclaim our empowerment in terms of our own healing process, we need to learn, okay, to begin to step out of our culturally defined ways of understanding health and healing and begin to embrace the subjective ways of understanding health and healing, okay? Where the self is empowered to begin to know and impact and influence our healing process, our healing potency. This is the challenge. Oftentimes we'll find ourselves turning to alternative approaches to health and healing in many cases, because oftentimes these are approaches that acknowledge the self, okay, that bring the self back into intimately into the healing process. Now, we can be limited in terms of our choices. If we're stuck in the subjective, then we're limited in terms of, well, what are the available options and wisdom and understanding and knowledge that rise out of or grow out of objective approaches to health and healing, and vice versa, of course. Anytime that we build a map, a way of understanding, a model, a scientific model of health and healing, an alternative model of health and healing. Even a language is a map, can be a map. But any time that we build a map, a way of understanding the world, we are making a constant negotiation, or we're involved in a constant negotiation between what to put into the map and what to leave out of the map. One way to say it is, what you pay attention to determines what you get. which is another way of saying what you pay attention to determines what you miss, all right? And, just as an example, these two maps of Colorado are two accurate maps of Colorado, and yet they depict totally different information, right? And so the point here is, when we're working with maps, even when we're working with paradigms, the measure of a paradigm, the measure of a map, isn't so much the truth of it, okay? The measure of a map is its usefulness, okay? So we're less concerned with getting into a discussion or dialogue around, when we think about health and healing and the holistic model, the truth of the scientific model versus the truth of alternative approaches. We're more interested in, do we have a way, fluidity, okay, a flexibility of working with the different systems of health and healing, okay, that enable us to choose and use the particular maps that are most useful to us in terms of engaging and facilitating and cultivating our healing process, our healing potency as we move through the world in our day-to-day lives. Now, paradigms actually are incommensurable. In other words, they are not together measurable. With our paradigms here in the health and healing model, we've got an objective paradigm and a subjective paradigm. Objective, the self is pulled out. Subjective, the self is put in. But they don't get each other. They come from two diametrically almost opposed ways of approaching the question of health and healing. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that paradigms, just because they don't get each other, that they aren't useful, okay, each of them in their own right, okay? But what it does mean is that if we want to engage with both paradigms, we have to understand how to step out of one paradigm in ways that enable us to step into another paradigm. You can hear the logical levels that are happening in terms of our fundamental understanding of paradigms, okay? So when you're stuck in one paradigm, it's like, in some ways, it's like that cliche of all you have is a hammer and everything's a nail, okay? Now, we want to and need to, frankly, be able to look at the body, the mind, and the spirit, okay? And then the encompassing environment from both the subjective and the objective paradigms. When we do this, when we look at this dynamic, body, mind, spirit, and environment, from the subjective paradigm, we get a certain class of information that is incredibly potent. When we step back out and we look at the body, mind, spirit, and environment through the lens from the objective paradigm, we get another class of information equally potent, clearly. Consider the statement, if I've got septic appendicitis, get me to a hospital, right? Don't place crystals on my chakra. You can do that after you get me to a hospital. And that simple statement underscores the dynamic between essentially an empirical scientific biomedical approach to medicine versus a whole confluence or constellation of alternative medicines and wisdom traditions that support our health and healing, but from a more subjective based way of understanding, a more subjective paradigm, okay? The thing is that one is not better than the other. The thing is that there's a time and a place for each of them, and do we have the requisite flexibility to do the dance to get us to the places and to the means of understanding as conditions warrant, right? Now, this is deadly serious. One of the acknowledged most intelligent geniuses of our era got caught in this trap, arguably. Now, and we all know who this person is, and arguably Steve Jobs got caught in the subjective paradigm of health and healing, okay? A very valid one, but one that kept him from information, procedures, and techniques available that, well, had they been pursued, could have prolonged his life. We are talking about things that affect people in a day-to-day way and manner, and that have deadly, mortal consequences, okay? So this is incredibly important to me, this understanding of the holistic model, this understanding of the holistic model, which enables us to begin to engage with our healing process as we need, okay? And in the variety of ways that we need, okay? That allow us to be most whole. Healthy means whole. Most whole, okay? Most flexible, response able with regard to the environment around us, joyful, happy in our body, in our mind, and in our spirit. Okay, so where to from here?